So basically what I've got is I have 3 pedals on here. These are pedals that I've determined have a sensitivity to batteries versus a power supply. So I have on this side a Chalks power supply, the Chalks 4, and on the opposite side over here,
welcome back to GFI System Podcast. Our guest today is the founder of Vertex Effects, widely known for steel string, Ultraphonix, Mel compressor, T-drive, dynamic distortion. He also built rigs for industry's top professionals, including, but not limited to, Tosin Abasi, Cory Wong, Erick Wells, Michael Thompson, David Grissom, Michael Pope, Rhett Shull. Please welcome, out of Oakland, California, the rig doctor himself, Mason Marangella. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. That was probably one of the best preambles that's ever been said about prior to conversations. So thank you.
Yeah, man. I've been listening to Mike Tyson on the podcast, so I was inspired by that.
Yeah. Well, certainly in boxing, there's some pretty illustrious introductions.
Yeah, man. Before we have a lot of questions for you, okay. And but we want to start with something really light first.
Okay.
How long do you spend on making one episode of YouTube video?
Well, I have a lot of help, so it doesn't fall on just one person, except in the very beginning. I did, when I was sort of figuring out whether this was something that was viable. It was a long time, but I didn't know much about video editing. I didn't know much about video shooting. And so there was kind of a learning curve, and I didn't want to hire somebody initially until I could tell that this was something that was going to be something that we would be doing on an ongoing basis with any sort of consistency. So I probably, if it was just me doing it, we would be talking about 20 hours or something like that. But now I have somebody helping me shoot it. I have somebody helping me edit. And so most of the concepts now are already brought to me by the team. So they're like, hey, we want to do something about ampless rigs, or we want to do something about wet, dry, wet systems, or we want to do something, and they kind of look at the commentary that comes in through YouTube, and then we'll gauge what the future videos might look like based on what people are asking to see, or what maybe is incomplete in the video topics that we have that could touch on something that people are asking for. So now I would say it's probably more like an 8-hour process between like the shooting and the editing. And a lot of it too is that you have to wait, on YouTube, you upload something, and then we'll have our team of people watch it. And a lot of times the edit will be done, but then there's like something that we missed. So the other day we were doing one on MIDI cables, which I'm sure that, guys like Henry will be able to appreciate. And when we did the MIDI cable ones, the editor had inverted the pins. And so when I was talking about what pins to solder to, pin 2 didn't have a shield on it. So that's a problem. Based on what our directions were. So sometimes we'll finish an edit and it'll be mostly right, but then we have to re-upload it to YouTube, and when you're doing it in 4K, it can take like 3 or 4 hours, so that can sometimes elongate the process, but generally I'd say around 8 hours.
So you went to UC Berkeley.
I did.
Can you tell us, you started with electrical engineering, just like Henry?
Well, I wanted to do electrical engineering, but I wasn't as smart as Henry. In the electrical engineering degree there was really directed toward computer science. And a lot of people that were going to Berkeley really wanted to work at Google, or they wanted to work at Facebook. Really wasn't a thing back then, because this is in the mid 2000s. But now a lot of them would go to Facebook and other places like that where they could major in computer science. And I wanted to do that, but there wasn't a lot of programs that you could take that were specifically geared toward analog engineering or sound or anything like that. And And so when I had that realization, when I was, at the point where I needed to declare a major, I kind of just looked at what I had credits for accumulated, and I went to the guidance counselor and just said, what's the easiest path for me to graduate? And then I can study and do enrichment on these topics separately that are going to be more specific to what my interests are. And so that's what I did. And so I didn't get any degree or, I think I took one class that had anything to do with electronics my entire college career. Most of it was done at a community college separately from UC Berkeley.
Where did you go?
What's that?
Where did you go for the community college?
Santa Rosa Junior College.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I went to the Enza College.
Okay, yeah, that's close by.
Yeah. And let's take it back to the beginning. Where are you from originally? Like, where did you grow up in Northern California?
Actually, we moved a lot. I was actually born in Oakland, but I only lived here until about 1988. I was born in 1985. And then my parents moved to Mammoth, which is like a ski resort town in California. And we lived there for a couple of years, and then we moved to Santa Barbara. And I grew up, I'd say like where I think of being a kid, or what I can remember as being a kid, was in Santa Barbara, which is kind of about 90 miles north of Los Angeles.
Sunny Santa Barbara.
Yes.
Oh, you're lucky.
Yeah, it was a great place. A great place to be a kid. I wouldn't want to live there now. It's kind of more of like an older adult, kind of area. But as a kid, it was a great place to be a kid.
So as a musician, when did you started playing guitar?
I started playing guitar in middle school, and I was playing piano before that. I started taking piano lessons when I was about 8. And I wanted to play guitar, but my parents they only like classical music and like jazz. And so they only let me play acoustic guitar for a couple years. And then eventually I was able to talk them into getting me an electric guitar. But that took a few years. So I didn't get an electric guitar until I was in high school. I had an acoustic guitar for 2 years before that.
And talk us through the history of Vertex Effects.
Okay. Well, when I was in college, my interest was in, I actually thought I wanted to do guitar stuff, like specifically guitar building. And I was focused mostly on doing kits where you would buy like a Warmoth body and a neck, and then you would, like a kind of like a one that was CNC'd, but maybe the headstock was just a block, and so you could shape it into whatever your particular headstock design was and finish it and stuff like that. But I found that it was actually really difficult, really, really hard to do that. And I built a few guitars, and it was all kind of, again, from parts. And I found that really difficult. So that was initially what I thought that I wanted to do, but I was really interested in the electronics because I tried to do my own pickups. I tried to do some other things. I was terrible at them. I had no experience. I was sort of learning that stuff from scratch. After kind of taking 2 guitars through the process of like learning how to finish them and all this stuff, I decided, you know what, I don't actually really want to do this. What I really want to just focus on is the electronics part. It's cleaner, it's easier, I can do this. And so what I started doing was amplifiers, and I was taking some courses in the community college level, learning how to do kind of basic analog stuff. And I knew how to do kind of basic things like, fix broken pots, or, rewire input jacks, or, fix broken tube sockets, and some kind of really basic things. But I put out these ads on Craigslist where I would say, I'll fix your amp for free. You just pay for the parts, because I just wanted experience, and I couldn't charge like a technician would to really like repair stuff. And I would tell people generally, like, if it was something that I thought was too complicated or not, I wasn't, didn't have enough of an understanding. So I didn't work on anything solid state. I didn't work on anything that had really complicated, like PC board layers. Like at the time somebody had brought me a Mesa Boogie dual rectifier, and now I realize the problem, they have all these issues with their relays, but I didn't really know how to deal with that back then. I was like 18. So, stuff like that I couldn't do, but basic Fender, like blackface Fender stuff, that was pretty easy for me to do. And so I got a lot of experience doing that. And even in college, I still kind of would keep these ads up on Craigslist where I would do stuff for parts. And I eventually started charging instead of just doing it for parts. But the problem became that I had so many amplifiers in my room, and it was against the fire code of the university. You can't be blocking entrances to the dormitory. And I had all these amps because people were bringing me all sorts of amps to do repairs on. That the advisor at the dorm said, you can't do this anymore. Like it's unsafe, and if there's a fire, everybody's going to die in your suite. And so I was like, well, I still like doing electronic stuff. What can I do that's kind of in the same wheelhouse? And at that time, the mod craze with Robert Keeley and Analog Man was blowing up, and I decided that I would put out the same ad and change it from amps to say guitar pedals, and I'll copy the Robert Keeley Tube Screamer mod or the Analog Man vintage mod, and I'll do it for $20, and so I had a ton of people just emailing me, like, yeah, I'll bring you my pedal, and those I could fit 100 pedals underneath my mattress, and so it was easy for me to get into that. That's kind of how it started.
Mason, do you still have the picture of the amps?
The amps in the room?
Yeah.
No, this was before camera phones. So this would have been in 2003 or something like that, so I didn't have a camera phone. I had one of those Nokia brick phones. So no, I don't have a picture of that. Unfortunately though, that would have been fun,
Yeah, man.
It was like 70s twin reverbs, like not really like cool amps. There was like kind of silver face Fenders and stuff like that had been, people did weird stuff too. There's a lot of Grateful Dead fans in the Bay Area, and a lot of them wanted the Jerry Garcia thing. So they would have these twin reverbs, and they kind of retrofit them to look like, Jerry Garcia amps, and put big, like Altec speakers or JBLs in them.
So when did you get the name Vertex Effects? Is there any particular reason or story out of it?
No, it actually is a very uncool story. It just sounded like a cool name, and originally I was going to be called something else, and I don't even remember what this was because it was a long time ago. And I remember like within a day of me having bought the domain name that I got like an email from some like paper supply company that had that name, and they said, I got an email from their legal team, and I was like, well, this name doesn't work. And I was taking a math class at the time, and they were talking about, it was learning about, vertices, and I was like, oh, that name Vertex, that kind of sounds cool. It sounds like something you'd hear like in an audio company or something like that. And so I the domain was available, Vertex Effects, and so I bought that domain, and I've been running with it ever since. There was no premeditated name choice with that particular with the name that stuck with the company. So I don't have a cool story for it.
It's amazing. I didn't know that you started with amps, and it does making more sense now that a lot of your pedals are actually amp-like.
Yeah,
it's actually.
I'm glad that I didn't do amps, because that is a hard business to be in. People want to buy 20 pedals, but not many people have 20 amps. And the overhead of pedals is so much lower, especially when you're dealing with analog distortion pedals. I mean, there's just not, it's a lot easier to deal with as a company. So for that, I'm grateful that pivot, where it forced me into that, even though that at the time it seemed like it was I was very upset, because I really thought I wanted to be this amp guy. When I was a kid and I took guitar lessons, I got to know Bill Crenard, the guy who founded Two Rock, and I used to take guitar lessons right next to where he had a hi-fi repair shop. And I remember, I'd talk to him when I'd be waiting for my guitar teacher to call me into the studio to start my lesson. And he didn't even have Two Rock yet. He was just repairing equipment. So he kind of inspired me, in a lot of ways to kind of get into doing that. Or at least I always had that thought in my head, as a fantasy. And then when you hit it big with Two Rock and John Mayer was using their amps and all that stuff, it kind of just further solidified that in my head as sort of a possible thing. And so it was devastating when I was told that I couldn't fix amps anymore because of a fire hazard.
Jonas is a big John Mayer fan, by the way.
Yeah.
And you discuss a lot about John Mayer and SRV tone, but it will be interesting to have your thoughts, philosophy on the tone. SRV, John Mayer, what do you have on it?
Well, I think that there's a disconnect, and Jonas and I can rap about this. I think there's a big disconnect between what people hear on the records, and then like what they sound like in isolation. And then when you're at home, you can't use a super reverb on 7. You can't use a Dumble steel string singer like all the way up. And so there's this gap between the consumer and the professional, and it has nothing to do with skill level. It's almost strictly environmental. And so like if you're playing at your house, the combination of equipment might actually be very dissimilar to what Stevie Ray Vaughan would use, because Stevie Ray Vaughan wasn't playing in a 12-foot by 10-foot bedroom. He was playing on a stage with 20,000 people in it. And so there's these gaps, that we're trying to fill. And in a lot of, I think, making pedals is sort of figuring out how you can distill that sound and make it approachable for somebody who will not have that context in their purview when they're playing. They're never going to, or most likely never going to be playing at, any of at Carnegie Hall, and so these are just kind of things that we have to consider when you're voicing a pedal off of a famous amp or off of a famous guitar player. How do you get it to sound the same even when this player, has, 1/100th of the experience of Stevie Ray Vaughan and doesn't have the same gear, but really likes that sound and wants to go after it? How do we inspire them in their environment that is not the same? And so I'd say that, I don't think it's that much of a secret. You got to have, a mid-range emphasized overdrive pedal. You got to have a lot of reverb, and it helps if you have a clean Fender amp platform that you can maybe scale the wattage of based on the room that you're playing. 100-watt amp's not going to work good for you if you're in a bedroom, but maybe a 20-watt one would with the similar gear, and so I don't know what Jonas, what's your take on it?
I think your explanation is I've never I only play John Mayer in my studio bedroom. That's it, Mason. But you,
that's perfect, because that's how 90% of the consumers of our products will use.
And I just bought, the HX Storm, right?
Yeah.
And then there was one guy in Singapore. He played so good. His name is Ibrahim for John Mayer. So I asked him, I DM him, can I get your preset of John Mayer tone? And he emailed me. Of course, I purchased it, and then it sounds for me in my ear. It's so good. It's freaking good, amazing. Yeah, I think in future, like you said, 90% they only play in the studio, in the house, play in a very small hex tom or similar like that.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Yeah. But I think you personally, you can feel John Mayer in your face, right?
Yeah, you can feel it in your face, like when you're in front of it.
Yeah, I saw in your Instagram you watched face-to-face John Mayer in the
I've been to a few of the rehearsals, especially before the Search for Everything tour.
Yeah.
So I was there, right in front of the amp and everything like that, with about 20 other people in the room, and that's it. And that was a pretty incredible experience, and it was also really good to get a sense of what's actually coming off the amps, because in that context, I mean, there were mics, but I was standing in front of the monitors. Yeah. So I'm not hearing anything that's going into the front of the house. I'm hearing what's coming right off the amp. And the amps are pretty clean, and a lot of it is the pedals, and the thing that I caution people about when using tube screamers, and a lot of people talk about, how much they hate tube screamers, but if you look at the guys who are really using them effectively, they're not using that much of the gain, because a lot of us in our bedrooms, we feel like in order to get that much sustain, we need to increase the gain a whole lot and bring down the level, but it actually causes the bandwidth to compress quite a bit. and you get way less of your amp, and you get sort of this EQ that sort of overtakes everything. And when you look at a lot of the John Mayer settings, and this isn't universal, but in a lot of the settings, the amp is so clean, he's not getting a ton of overdrive from the tube screamer. It's really more of an EQ and a volume boost more than this distortion, this mess of distortion. And that's one thing, that having a loud amp that's getting hit harder by the tube screamer, and also helps cut out some of the low end, which is good on those Dumble amps, which have a lot of low end frequency response. So it kind of tightens everything up. And if you're playing in your bedroom, at a low volume, you're probably not producing a lot of bass frequencies as it is. And so I can see why guys, get really upset with tube screamers. They go, oh, it doesn't work, or it sounds wrong, or it's too much mid-range, or whatever. But, I'll tell you, even though it's not a cool, sexy answer, a tube screamer in a mix sounds incredible. And even though it doesn't produce a lot of bass, or it cuts a lot of bass out, it's sort of the right frequency for a guitar to sit at, especially a Strat, which has really, scooped out pickups for the most part.
And
how about the Silver Sky guitar?
I like them. The only challenge for me is that the radius is so curved, and I've become spoiled with newer interpretations of vintage guitars with the custom shop stuff, and they're almost all invariably 9.5 or greater. Although one thing I'll tell you is I was hanging out with Justin Derrico, who's the guitar player for Pink, and also for NBC's The Voice, which is like a game show kind of show, kind of like like American Idol or some of the other singing competitions. And they were rehearsing next to John Mayer when I was there at that rehearsal, and he was talking with John about the guitar, and actually they gave Justin one of the Silver Skies, and he was telling me that John Mayer's one is a 12-inch radius. So I don't think that John Mayer's, I wonder if, it could have just been that one that he was messing with. This is before the Silver Sky, or maybe it was out, but it was kind of early days of the Silver Sky. And he said that the ones that John had were not 7.25 radius. So I don't know if that was something that changed over time, or maybe it was just that one. But that's my only challenge with that guitar. Is it's great and very comfortable to play, plain rhythm, certainly excellent build quality. But you have to have your action pretty high in order to make it work when you're on a Silver Sky, to get nice bends.
Okay, if you only have 3 pedals in your pedal board, what are those pedals to make the John Mayer tone?
To make the John Mayer tone? Okay, any tube screamer will do. It's like pizza. It's all good, right?
Which tube screamer? Because there are a lot of types, right?
I don't think I think in a mix, in a blind context, it would be very difficult for somebody to distinguish a TS9 from a TS10 from a TS808. I mean, there's not really a whole lot of difference between them. Like on the 10 that John Mayer uses, I'm trying to remember the schematic, but I think the only thing that's different is the input impedance, I think, is a little higher on the TS10, so that the pickups aren't as loaded. I think it's somewhere around 1 meg. So it's kind of more like what your guitar would see if you were plugged into the front of a Fender amplifier or a Dumble amplifier. Typically, they're all 1 meg input impedance. And there's one other change to either one of the caps or resistors. I don't remember. Obviously there's some op amp changes, but I would be surprised a mic'd cabinet with 3 different tube screamers. I think it's going to be negligible. The difference is going to be single digit percentile. So if I were just saying in a generalized sense, you got to have a tube screamer. That's quintessential. If your amp has reverb, then you wouldn't need it. But I would say like a slapback delay, an analog delay of some kind. And obviously he uses the Aquapus, but I think the closest thing to it is a Boss DM2. Because that's essentially what the original Aquapus was, a DM2 with 3005 chips in it, and you can get a vintage DM2 for way less money than you can get a Aquapus for. A real Aquapus is like $1,000, $1,200. You can get a 80s Bucket Brigade Boss DM2 with the same chip for maybe 300, 250, something like that. So I'd say get a DM2, set that to a single repeat, get a tube screamer, and then, maybe some other sort of boost to add more gain to the tube screamer, like a Klon type thing. I think that those are kind of the three pedals to kind of get you there, and that'll get you through a lot of the John Mayer catalog, or at least from the iconic sounds that people typically refer to. Doesn't have like an envelope filter or any of the kind of later stuff, but really the gold standard for him was Continuum, and there wasn't a lot of fancy stuff on those rigs. All the rigs leading up to that album were very abbreviated compared to what he has now. And so a lot of people, I think, confuse the current John Mayer tone with the iconic sound, which was from 10 years ago or more. And the rig just wasn't that complicated then. It was like Aquapus, T-Rex replica, Boss BD2 with the Keeley mod, a tube screamer, the Keeley Katana, a Boss tuner, those Pete Cornish cables, which are Belden 8412 twisted pair shielded mic cables, where he cuts the shield off of one side.
And Jonas is heading out to Amazon now.
Oh man, Henry and Josh, they are always telling me that I will not be John Mayer because the hand is different.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be those differences, but all of us have a sonic touchstone that we all kind of draw from, and there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody's had that player that's influenced them, and I think that certainly you're not wrong in that in that thinking, because there's a whole market of people that are specifically just going after that tone. So I'm right there with you.
I'm curious, as a rig doctor, how many rigs have you built?
Oh boy, yeah. I was thinking about this the other day. I don't think it could be 1,000. That's too many, but definitely in the hundreds. 500 maybe, something like that.
How do you consult your patients? Is there a process?
Well, I actually don't do it as like a service. So if you go to our website, you won't see anything related to doing any sort of pedalboard services. Pretty much what I do is, we get an extraordinary amount of email about this every week. I probably say we get on average about 30 emails a week of people asking if I'll build them a pedalboard. And I usually respond to them all the same, or we have one of our customer service people respond to them and basically say, this isn't a service that we offer. However, we have an application process, and you can tell us what your proposal is. And if there's an alignment between what it is that our viewership is asking to see us teach about a certain subject area, and your rig meets that criteria, we'll have that on file to reference, and we'll talk to you, or we'll connect with you if there's an opportunity to collaborate. And if not, here's a list of other rig builders that we think that do an excellent job and that you might consider if you need to have something done urgently in order to meet a deadline or whatever it is that they have. And so that's typically how it works. And so some people, we contact them 6 months later and they say, actually I already had a rig built, or, I'm not really interested in that rig anymore. And sometimes we reach out to them and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you called, because, my pedalboard has been limping along and I really would love to do this rig with you. And so we do that. And sometimes in the interim, just other things come up, like a friend will call me and say, hey, can you help me with my rig, that somebody who I've known for a long time, and I want to help them. And so sometimes we'll just fill in some gaps with that. And then other times we'll get a call from a Tosin Abasi, and, we'll do it because, not so much because, again, it's anything that I do for a living that I'm trying to make, a bunch of money on, but I know that Tosin's audience will appreciate this content, and we can bring more people to the table to understand some of the best practices, because most of the guys that are doing the pedalboard thing professionally, they're mostly very secretive. They don't really like to talk about what they do or what cables they use or how they buffer. And some of it, I think, is because they don't, they actually don't know that much more than their customers. And I think in other cases, they think that they have something that's really proprietary, when really it's like there's only so many ways you can make a BJT buffer or a op-amp buffer. Like everything's been done, and so especially when you're talking about analog stuff like this, there's just not a whole lot of ways you can cut the pie, and so most of it I think is kind of frivolous, and so my goal is to give everybody the best information that I can. And then, if they're inclined to do it themselves, they have the information. And if they want to go hire somebody, those people are always going to be there, and they can go to them for that.
And on that note, you've been really, really generous in terms of giving out all this information. I mean, these are the informations that I've been looking for like 15 years. And, I've been trying to build my rig for the past 15 years and still not done. But yeah, man,
you're not in everybody's in that position. It's very, very common. And, you guys have to deal with this in the design of your pedals, choosing the right input and output impedances that sound best, or how are you going to keep the output stable on your digital delays and all these different things. I mean, this is a consideration I think a lot of the people that are making digital pedals have to consider almost more, because a lot of the overdrives, there's so few standards. You'll see an output impedance on an overdrive at 10K or 100K, and nobody will care about that. You couldn't make a specular Tempest with a 100K output impedance, like that would be a terrible line driver for any amount of capacitance on the output. So, I think that these are things that, we all have to consider. And so, a lot of us who are doing analog stuff, it seems like we get away with murder, on some of these specs on pedals, because, we're sort of borrowing from a time in the 1960s or the 1970s when they didn't really think much about, whether they loaded down guitar pickups, at 250K or whatever, they just didn't think about it.
Most of our listeners here for the GFI podcast are beginner guitar players.
Okay,
so
great.
Can you when it comes to building pedal boards, we have to think about the patch cables and then powers, buffer, and for beginners, what is your thoughts and philosophy on getting a basic tone that is workable in a versatile environment? What is thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the buffer is probably the least cool, but like most overlooked thing that people don't do a very good job of on their pedal boards. And a lot of that is that there's not a lot of understanding of what a buffer does. And really, I think that it's not a perfect example, but I think it's a pretty decent place to start, is that you should have an input buffer and an output buffer. So that means there's one at the beginning, the first thing that the guitar plugs into, and there's one at the end, which is the last thing that your pedal board hits before it returns to your amplifier. And the idea here is that it almost becomes like this firewall for the pedal board, so that the guitar is isolated from the pedals and the pedal board is isolated from the amp in terms of the impedance. So the input buffer's real purpose is to isolate the guitar from the pedal board by controlling the pickup loading. So you're making the guitar pickup think as though it's seeing the input of an amp, because most of the amplifiers that we use typically are around 1 meg. And the output buffer's job is to take, all of the changing impedances between all the different pedals, whether they're true bypass or not, anything that's on as a buffer. So it's going to nullify kind of the line driving qualities of your input buffer. At least you have this really high quality line driver at the end. It's going to take your long cables and run it back to the amplifier with as little degradation as possible. So that's the first thing, input and output buffer. Not just one, you need two, because a lot of guys will drop, whatever, $500 on a Pete Cornish input buffer, and then they leave their compressor always on as the first pedal in line. Well, they just paid $400 for a Pete Cornish input buffer that's only buffering the patch cable that's this long between it and the compressor. Now the compressor is their buffer for everything else. And so, you need to just keep in mind, you need an input buffer and an output buffer. All the stuff I just said in between here, just ignore that if you're new. And just make sure you have an input buffer and an output buffer. Or if you have something like a GFI pedal or something like that, like a Specular Tempest or something like that, that already has a pretty low output impedance, you can probably get away with not having an output buffer because it would be low enough. It sort of depends, the generalized spec I would say for people to look for in buffers is 1 meg input and somewhere around 100 ohms on the output. There's some pedals that can do that, like, some guys are making like Quan buffer clones using TLO 72s, and that's bogus for buffering. Like you can get, some of these guys are running them at 100 ohms on the output, but it has such poor output current, like I can't drive a long cable even if they're running at that. It's not stable for that. So I'd say, but as a generalized, that's a good place to look at. When you look at the specifications, look for 1 meg input, 100 ohm output impedance. 1 meg input, 100 ohm output. And then for cables, you got to go soldered if at all possible. I know that there's a temptation to use solderless, and a lot of guys will use them, even guys that are prominent on YouTube. And I would say from a consumer level, I understand the attraction, but if the goal is reliability, like you definitely want to go with a gas tight connection with solder. The other thing too is when you use solderless, you can't choose the cable, so there's cables are a filter for your sound. Every one of them is going to have a different impact on the sound. And when you use solderless, you are going to be tied to whatever the manufacturer of the plug is deciding to make it for. So if you're using Evidence Audio, you got to use Evidence Audio cable. That's not to say that it's a bad cable, but maybe that's not the sound that you want. Maybe those really exaggerate the top end, and you don't really want that. You don't want the filtering of the cable to kind of push you more toward the high end. Maybe you want something else. So you can't say, well, I like Mogami cable, but I'm going to use a Evidence Audio plug on it. It doesn't work that way. You got to use whatever it comes with. Or you're going to use a Georgel or whatever it is. You have to use their plug. So you're tied in to whatever cable that the solderless manufacturer is using. So I don't like that. My personal favorite, and what's on most of the John Mayer boards, is Mogami cable, and it's usually 2319 or 2524. I think that's a pretty good one for the pedal board. And the other thing I would say is isolated power supplies is a big thing, and now there's so many great switch mode isolated power supplies that are out there. A couple of the ones I really like are Chalks from Poland. They do an excellent job. Another one that is good is the Strymon one, and the True Tone one is also pretty good. Some of their supplies, when they do their switch mode technology, the way that they do it, sometimes the high frequency is in, or I've seen units where the high frequency that they chose is the oscillation of that is in the audio range, and so sometimes you can have a little bit of this weird high frequency noise in some of the supplies. Although I haven't heard it in any of the recent ones, so I wonder if that's something they remediated in later revs of the supply. But for the most part, those are kind of switch mode. They have one version that has an AC side that has a transformer, like a toroidal or an R core or a C core transformer in it, and that one is not fully switch mode because it's got the AC mains and a toggle for the 220 versus 120. But overall, switch mode power supplies are the way to go. You can put pedals on top of it. It's not going to be a problem like, on the stuff that's linear that has the transformers, because those have a kind of a loop area and the magnetic field that can cause some problems, especially if you put your Specular Tempest right in the magnetic field. That can sometimes cause a little problem with noise and stuff like that. So I would say stick to a switch mode power supply. If you're not sure what a switch mode power supply is, you can email us info@vertexeffects.com and we can direct you to different manufacturers of switch mode power supplies. I think in 5 years probably all of them will be switch mode, but we're sort of playing catch up here in guitar pedal world.
Yeah, man, it's definitely, the 120 and 220 is so important, and I use for the Voodoo Labs like that I use in the States. Brought it back home, Indonesia.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Of course, because I'm stupid. That's why.
Yeah, well, switch mode's great. Like we were saying, you plug it in any of the AC mains, it'll read your input voltage, and everything is still happy.
Mason,
sorry.
just wondering. Yeah, please, Josh.
Question: how about the G-Creek power supply? What do you think about it?
Well, it is technically a switch mode supply, and they have their mains coming into, I think they call it a generator or something like that, and then it distributes out to little smaller, sort of like individual switching supplies, and it works. You don't know though how much of the total current you've used on it as you expand it, so that's one drawback. The Chalks one has a percentage readout, so you can see how much of the total current from the primary supply has been pushed out. So if you have a max, let's say of 2 amps, you know how close you are to your 2 amps as you're expanding the supply. You don't have any sense of what that is on the gig rig, so that's one thing. The other thing is it's using kind of older, smaller versions of a speaker, tension clamp that you would use to, put speaker leads in a passive monitor of some kind. And I don't think that that's a particularly reliable way to do it compared to having individual soldered plugs. So the whole kind of module system, I appreciate that it's modular and you can move it around. I don't think that I don't think that anybody would agree that it's a more robust system than a power supply where everything is consolidated under one roof of just a single enclosure. And I think that this is probably why in the professional context, and this isn't a knock on gig rig, this is just saying I think it's really geared toward more of the consumer level, the same type of person that would be more into the solderless cables. You don't see pro rig builders, the legacy guys, Robert Bradshaw, Dave Friedman, any of those guys using those types of systems. And it's because they can't stake their reputation on the longevity of a system like that. And so they won't use solderless cables. They won't use, the clip-on for the plus and minus voltage, which is what those systems are. So can it work? Absolutely. Certainly lots of people use it and like it. It wouldn't be something that I would use. I prefer to have it consolidated into its own enclosure that is protected, that I don't have to worry about any of the leads getting knocked around, pushed, changed, coming undone, accidentally doing an inverted polarity by flipping the plus and minus by mistake, stuff like that. It is all problematic to me.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
What is your thoughts about utilizing the GFI Cabzeus in a rig?
Okay, well, I'm building a rig right now that utilizes this, and my favorite thing to use the Cabzeus for is a wet-dry-wet context. And there's a lot of misinformation about what wet-dry-wet is, but I'll break it down a little bit for you here. So the standard for wet-dry-wet, and this was established in 1980, is basically that you have all of your your instrument level effects, your distortions and all that stuff going into the front of the dry amplifier, and then you use a line level output out of the dry amplifier. So this is between the preamp and the power amp. So it's basically your output transformer padded down to line level with a level control that then feeds all of your wet effects. And so these would be things like, chorus, digital delay, reverb, things of that nature. These are all, again, at line level. And in many cases using, kind of doing a series parallel application where all the pedals are 100% wet. And you're using a mixer to blend those all in parallel. And so in a lot of the classic, 80s and 90s studio tones, the line level output would hit a chorus. The chorus would go, stereo into the mixer, and the choruses were always analog choruses because they would use those as the dry through the entire line. They'd go into a parallel mixer. They would go, usually the first mixer would have some sort of detune, usually an Eventide H3000, and some sort of digital reverb, a PCM series lexicon unit. Those would be, 100% wet effects. and in the mixer, and then that mixer would feed that stereo mix into a stereo delay mix. So usually, again, either Eventide or Lexicon stuff, and then that would feed stereo to the wet amps. Now, in the old days, what they would do is they would feed that stereo wet into a power amp that would then feed two cabinets that would be mic'd. And so they'd have one cabinet on the stage that would just be getting all the instrument level distortion, stuff on the dry amp, and then they'd have two other cabinets on the left and right that would be receiving the 100% wet effects that you've been mixing, and those would be mixed in acoustically with the dry amp. So it would be similar to what you would do if you were going to put, say, some reverb on something in Pro Tools. It's not a serial thing. The reverb is 100% wet, and you're mixing it in like you would in a mix bus. And this is kind of what they're doing on stage in the wet dry wet system. So to the GFI product, the reason why I love it is I can take the line level out just like I would normally. So everything in front of the dry amp looks the same. But then I go into my wet stuff. I can go into my same combination of series parallel effects, and I use different mixers for that. One that I really have been liking lately is made by Musicom Lab in Korea. It's called a Parallelizer. I use that for all my delay, reverb, and pitch stuff. And then I feed that stereo, instead of into a power amp, I go into the Cabzeus. And that is becoming my power amp, my speaker, and my mic for my wet, and I feed those directly into the front of house. So on stage with me, if I'm playing live, I'm just micing my dry amp, and my wet effects are going strictly to front of house. I can get those in my in-ears, I can get those in my wedges, and I'm getting them in front of house. I only have to have one amp on stage. So it removed me from having to have a power amp. It removed me from having to have two other 112 cabinets on stage. And typically those wet cabinets are very linear anyway. Like guys are, usually using vintage 30s in those in the old days. But those power amps were mostly not tube. They were usually solid state power amps. There wasn't a whole lot of tone benefit of using anything fancier than that. So the Cabzeus can give me a more dialable tone than that, and I can adjust the mic position and all that stuff. I never have to touch it. So I love it for that. It's one of the coolest tools that I have for doing a wet dry wet system, and I highly recommend that people use it because it's so easy, saves you a bunch of time, and it consolidates the rig, and it works with a normal pedalboard power supply. So it makes it really easy for me to accomplish this. And if I wanted to run it without a wet dry wet, or I just want to do it wet dry, I could just use one of the outputs. I don't have to use the stereo side. And but usually it's just so easy. I just have my Apollo here, and I can run it like that at home, or I take it to to a gig or whatever, and it's makes transport really easy.
I am blown away as I listen to that. Henry, this is a question for Henry actually. When you design Cabzeus, is that something that you have in mind for wet dry wet system, or is that something? Tell us more, Henry.
I did not actually know about wet dry wet system when I was designing the pedal. So yes, I'm surprised too.
It's so easy. Like I'm surprised that nobody's doing it this way. Like basically the topic of the video, would be something like the title of it would be like the easiest way to make a wet dry wet rig. It's seriously the best way to do it, because some of the incorrect ways of doing wet dry wet means you have to have 3 amps on stage, and that's just not how it is. The wet speaker cabinets are just getting return only, and so there's no reason to have a tube amp getting the 100%, or just using the power amp section of a tube amp to get 100% wet return of these effects. Your monitor is just as good of an option. I mean, the other thing you could do too is if you don't have, if you're not miking anything, you could just put the Cabzeus into 2 powered monitors. You could just have 2 QSC monitors or JBLs or whatever, and that could be your wet.
Right.
Dude, we can jump all over the place here. We still have a lot of questions to you, man.
I got as much time as you guys have, so let's
talk about the pedal boards. You have from your website 17 by 10, 20 by 11, 26 by 14, and 29 by 15. Tell us how the sizes came about? Is that the standard that you set based on your experience building boards, or I think the question is, when you have rigs that you wanted to build, what is your philosophy? Do you have something already previewed in your mind, or how do you? What's the feature? What's the process like when you're building the rigs?
Yeah, well, so the first part of that about the sizing, we it's not typically the sizing that I would use, but I also didn't have the ability to add the tier on top where I could move it back and have it hinge. And we're not the first people to do this. I think the first commercially available pedal board that did this was the Schmidt Array pedal boards in Germany, and they're excellently built without question. The biggest drawback, though, from my perspective, is that they're so heavy because they're made out of wood, and so doing it out of aluminum, like I'm doing, allows me that function, but allows me to keep it a lot lighter. The other challenge of those rigs is that if you can't carry them onto a plane, you have to have a separate case for the case that it already comes in, because it's not designed to go underneath a plane. You can't have it in a cartage situation. So you have to have a separate flight case, which just exaggerates the weight that's already pretty heavy. And so what I did is I designed the systems based on the most common case sizes that are available from Pelican, SKB, and Gator. And they all have a version of their cases that are designed for flying. So they meet all of the criteria for the ATA and for TSA, which, at least traveling domestically in the United States are all critical measures that you need to account for in terms of size. And then it also has to meet whatever the weight criteria is, which is typically 50 pounds. So the goal is that we would have no pedal board that, when fully assembled in the case, would exceed the weight limit of 50 pounds, unless you were using really heavy pedals. Like Vemaram has one of the heaviest pedals that I've ever seen. They're made out of brass. If you had all pedals with Vemaram on our largest board, it would weigh over 50 pounds. But by and large, standard pedal weights and sizes, completely filled up, are going to weigh under 50 pounds. So that was the intent with the pedal board, is that they weren't so big that you couldn't travel with them, even when it's the largest size. So that was kind of how we decided what we were going to do. Now, the second part of your question was about, do we have a vision of how things are supposed to look? Well, in the old days, before I had this, basically we could make any size that we want, because I would use a company called Get Off My Case, GOMC is how they're abbreviated, and I could just send them any measurement that I wanted, and they would make the pedal board that size. So there wasn't any limitations. However, most of these pedal boards, even if they're a bigger size, can fit into one of our pedal boards, because with that tier riser, it's basically like adding a third row that you no longer have to worry about. The only problem with it is that if you don't use a switcher of some kind, then the benefits of those pedal boards is diminished significantly, because you won't have access to things that are underneath the riser. So there are drawbacks to having this style of board, but this is typically the type of board that I'm making most often, and this is really what our customer base is asking for. And if it doesn't work for them, I always give them the contact information for Get Off My Case, and they can always go and buy a customized surface that's not within the confines of what we offer through our website.
Yeah, man, and your hinge is definitely, I couldn't get over your hinge. If you're a rig doctor, I'm a door doctor. I sell hinge. I fix doors. And when I saw the hinge on the riser, I was like, dang, bro.
Yeah, it's worked out well. I can't take a lot of credit for designing it. The company that makes all of our enclosures for our pedals actually is making the pedal boards. And so they, we've been trying different variations of this over a couple of years, but they were the ones that came up with the best system where it could do that reliably and still have structural integrity.
Yeah, man. Jumping over a bit here, tell us the Cory Wong story.
About how I met him, or okay,
about how you met him and how you guys collaborated.
Okay. I met Cory because we had, I think he had either he emailed us or one of our artist relations guys messaged him and asked him if he would be interested in checking out some of the pedals. And it turned out that he was in the Bay Area doing a recording session at George Lucas's studio. George Lucas, who made Star Wars, and it's not too far from here. And so, they gave him my number, and he called me, and he said, "Hey, I've seen your stuff. It looks really cool, and I'm actually in your neck of the woods. Why don't we meet up for lunch? Because I'm still here for 2 more days, but I finished my session." And so we met for lunch and hung out for a little bit, and we seemed to get along on a not only a kind of like a talking about pedals and gear, but also friendship basis. And the next day he called me in the morning. He's like, "Hey, what are you doing today? I'm off all day. Like, let's hang out, And so he came over to the house and he hung out with me and we had dinner with my wife and everything. And so it was just started off as that. And then, he started seeing some of the videos that we were putting out, and he said, "Hey, I got this pedal board. It's I put it in my suitcase, and it's not really that good. And I made it with my wife out of plywood from the hardware store, and could you help me?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so got to help him on one rig, and I think I've built a couple for him now, and I've built one for Theo Katzman, who's another guy who's in Wolfpack with him, and maybe in time we'll have a board for every member of Wolfpack.
Yeah, man. And I saw his reaction the first time he tried the board. It's priceless, yeah. It's priceless.
Yeah, he's very animated. So he doesn't. That was a natural reaction. We just roll the camera, and then whatever he says, he says. He's a great showman. And
is the similar reaction with Tosin?
Oh yeah,
Erick Wells.
Yeah, I mean,
it's pure joy.
Well, I think part of it's hard to we don't like to do any sort of like retakes of that particular part because we want it to be as sincere as possible, but sometimes it seems sort of unbelievable how surprised they are, because everybody's seen the renovation shows where people fix their house and there's like a before and after or a makeover show, and somebody changes their hair and all this stuff, and it's like, wow, they really looks nice. So I think that obviously they all probably have seen that stuff and have some sense of how they're supposed to react, but I have to be honest, we could never have asked for more honest reactions from any of the pedal board reveals. I mean, typically they know a little bit about what's happening because I'll send them pictures like through text beforehand, but usually we kind of withhold the last maybe 20 or 30% of the build so that it has some element of surprise by the time they walk through the door.
Can you share us who has the most complicated rig so far that you've built?
Most complicated rig.
Oh, it took the longest for you to make.
Okay. Well, one of them that took a really long time was for John Shanks, who's like a producer in LA and also a guitar player. He wasn't playing for Bon Jovi at the time, but he was just doing production. But he had a really huge board. I mean, it was like the size of a door. It was really big. And it took a really long time to make that. It had a lot of Pete Cornish pedals. Had some really at the time it had some of the best pedals that were around. And it was, so that one took a really long time. I remember that took a long time. Complicated ones, this one it wouldn't sound like it's going to be complicated, but it was. I was doing this rig with the Line 6 HX effects, and I was trying to make it so that it could run wet, dry, in an effects loop, stereo, mono, or wet, dry, wet. And so it was kind of like it was a lot of planning to kind of figure out how I needed to make the patch bay that could accommodate all those routing configurations, and then also how to program the HX effects so that the internal routing could reflect all those contingencies. And so maybe the building didn't take that long, but the programming took a really long time. And I was using a Morningstar MIDI programmable switcher, or the MIDI programmable looper, but I was using the HX effects as the actual stomp box component of it, the switcher part. And so it took a lot of time to get all that dialed in, but eventually it happened. But for as few pedals as were on it, it was probably 6 pedals plus the HX effects. I think it took 4 days or something like that to kind of get it fully dialed in. And I remember being on the phone with one of the guys at line 6 to try to figure out how to like do some things that weren't typical of it. And it was kind of but I like doing stuff like that. It's fun. It was on one of my own rigs, so it's better than when it's for me. I don't have anybody who's frustrated because they're waiting for me to finish.
And John Shanks uses GFI also, if I remember.
Okay, cool.
I'm not sure. Maybe you put it in there.
This is a long time ago. This is probably the John Shanks one was probably 7 or 8 years ago. It was a real long time ago. I just remember it took a long time. Yeah, it was a really comprehensive rig.
I'm sure Jesse have some questions for you, Jesse or Josh or Henry.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
From your perspective as a pedalboard builder, is there a single universally preferable position of jacks in a pedal?
Universally prefer. I mean, my opinion is to put them on the top, but that's mostly just because it's easier for me to route them in a switcher context. But ultimately, people are making a big deal about it, but about having top jacks. But the reality is, in like a Hammond 1590 size box,
right,
if they're on top, you're adding more surface area, to the vertical dimension, and if they're on the side, you're adding more to the horizontal dimension. The worst contingency is if you have jacks on the side and power on the top, because now you've increased the available surface area or you've lessened it, or I guess increased it for the pedal, but lessened your total available for the pedal board. So usually my advice is if you're going to make a pedal and you're going to do side jacks, make sure your power supply DC input is on that side too. If you're going to do rear mounted, or top mounted jacks, make sure the DC and the quarter inch is up there. For something like yours, like the Specular Tempest, you're already oriented horizontally, so it wouldn't make sense for you to put them on the side. But ultimately, it's just a trade off. It's like, where do you want to eat up your space? Do you want to eat up horizontally, or do you want to eat up vertically? I don't think at the end of the day there's a surface area advantage of one or the other, as long as you are consistent. Or if you're using the standard pedal size boxes. But again, if you have something that's already designed as a horizontal facing pedal, obviously top jacks are going to be critical for you, because and I think it's I guess the challenge on yours is where to put the MIDI, and you have to put it in the front on the Specular Tempest.
Yeah, that's quite unusual.
But I would imagine that's a space issue, right?
Yes, that's right. And I'm trying to avoid to put it on the sides, because, as you say, it will take additional sides.
Now, what about using TRS for the MIDI? Is that a consideration for future revisions?
Yeah, might be. I'll consider that, actually.
Yeah,
a lot of people are doing that right now.
What's the downside from your perspective, though? Because I'm not an expert on MIDI.
The downs for the pedal builders, I don't think there's any downsides, but for the users, maybe they need to purchase a special cable for that, or an adapter, MIDI adapter.
Now, have you noticed that there's not a standard, though, for some of the TRS to MIDI in terms of what pins they use or the assignment?
I'm not aware of any standard for that.
Yeah, it seems like it's all over the place.
Right.
We need to form the MIDI committee and determine these standards for guitar pedals.
Yeah.
Well, it used to be in the old days that if you had a 5-pin MIDI that you weren't supposed to run phantom power on the 2 last pins, and that's why they did the 7-pin MIDI, so you could have you could keep 1 through 5 the same, and then 6 and 7 would be strictly for phantom. But I guess for MIDI, you don't really need the shield on 2, do you? For guitar, you just need the 2 pins to the left and right of 2.
Yeah, that's all you need for MIDI, actually.
Yeah. So why aren't we just using TS cables?
Well, TS, we cannot use it because usually the shield is connected to the ground. But
if you cut away 2, I've seen a lot of them. I've seen some MIDI cables where they only connect the shield on the MIDI send, and they disconnect the shield and float it on the inputs.
Oh yeah. You don't need the shield on the input, but you do need it on the output. Right.
But are they concerned about, is it a ground loop that they're concerned about, and that's why some guys will float the...
It's a standard.
How do you know when you buy a MIDI cable which side has the shield connected? I think it's connected on both sides.
The shield is not connected on the pedal itself. So if the cable is connected, it doesn't matter.
Right. So on the cable, the shield's on both sides?
Yeah.
Right. And they're floating it on the send, on the pedal.
Yes.
Got it. Yeah, well, I was just showing how to make MIDI cables. I was noticing on some of the really cheap ones, they actually don't use a shield on pin 2. It's just a normal wire. It's not shielded.
Okay. Yeah.
But I don't think it would matter for this application that it was shielded.
Maybe not.
It was just a standard, insulated wire.
Yeah.
I was thinking.
Yeah, go for it.
Just thinking. When are you guys going to collab together to make the unicorn pedal?
I'll tell you the pedal that I want to collaborate with you guys on. Are you guys ready for this?
Yep.
So I'm making a tri-stereo chorus right now, analog.
Okay.
Fully analog, Bucket Brigade, the whole thing. But the problem is that for the analog, all the applications of a tri-stereo chorus always had pitch shift in parallel with it afterwards, and that would create the modulation sound fully, because the chorus only adds so much, and then they have plus and minus a few cent detune in parallel after it, which was digital coming from the H3000 that Eventide made. Now, I am not skilled at all with DSP. I mean, I can program like a spin chip, but anybody can do that, if just like a little bit. But it's not, I'm not versed at all in a lot of this technology. So what would be cool is if we had the tri-stereo chorus, all analog, and then we had GFI do the H3000 detune, because everybody was buying that huge rack unit and they were just using it for detune. That was the only thing they ever used it for. All those studio guys, whether Steve Lukather or Michael Thompson or Michael Landau or any of those guys, Dan Huff, they only used it for detunes. They had this like $5,000 harmonizer that would just do detune.
So you're planning to make a tri-chorus pedal with the pitch shifting part
in parallel.
With it. Okay.
Yeah. So we need the pitch shifting. GFI needs to come in with the pitch shifting side.
I'm just watching it here, guys. You guys do the work. Henry,
might work.
The ball is on you, man.
Yeah. I'll send you my H3000, but it's at 120, so you're gonna have to get a transformer.
No problem.
Yeah, but that's an amazing sound. Like I'll have to send you some clips that I've been working on. I'm using the Eventide right now for the second part of that. But it's amazing, because the tri-stereo has, the 3 delay lines in it, and they sound incredible. Obviously those old Bucket Brigade chips are hard to get, but I found, I think, a decent substitute with the cool audio.
Oh, yeah.
And I was trying to do it all analog, where I would get like a longer Bucket Brigade chip that I would have come or be in the chorus, so that it would go out longer past the chorus and would allow it to detune by way of the Bucket Brigade chip, extending that delay time. But you can't really use 3005s because there's like too much capacitance between the changes there, and so like a 3007 was a little bit more linear sounding. And so that seemed to work better, because the problem is if you get a 3005, it darkens the chorus so much by the time the signal is fully delayed that it takes away from the fidelity and kind of the hi-fi aspect of the tri-stereo chorus, because it was pretty almost like a synthesizer. It kind of sounds more like a synthesizer pad or something like that. So I try to do it that way, but I haven't had much success. So I think we just need to go with the digital format.
I think it's the way to go for pitch shifting.
Yeah.
And let me have the honor to name the pedal.
Okay.
It's the unicorn handle. Not handle. What am I speaking about? Pedal.
The unicorn pedal? But what about JHS? Doesn't he have a unicorn pedal?
Oh.
Yeah, they do.
I've been out of the loop.
I think that will add to the mystique. There's going to be a lawsuit around it, and this has all the makings of a scandal, which I think is
bad publicity is good publicity, guys.
Yeah, we'll be like the Paris Hilton of
Mason. Jesse, I'm sure you have questions for Mason. Jesse.
Hi, Mason. I'm the one who's sending emails to you.
Yes. Good to communicate with you now. I guess we met at NAMM, but good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, I was also in Santa Barbara.
Oh, cool.
Early 2000.
Oh, cool.
Nice place.
Yeah.
Yeah. Went to UCSB.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's where my parents went.
Cool. So when's the next pedal coming out?
It's coming out in a few weeks. I'm actually going to Sweetwater at the end of this week to do some of the promotion for it. So Sweetwater is going to be releasing it exclusively for the first 30 days, and then it'll go wide to all the other dealerships. And I sent you guys some info kind of on what it is, and to kind of sneak preview it. It's sort of the ultimate kind of clean amp platform, but it has the ability to be used direct as an amplifier, and doesn't have any sort of speaker emulation in it or load. But if you pair it with something, for example, like the Cabzeus or another quality speaker emulator, it really does resemble a tube amp in really every possible facet. I mean, when you listen to a recorded track and you listen to this pedal through, in our video demonstration that we're going to be releasing first, we're actually using a mono Cabzeus set to the Vintage 30 12-inch speaker simulation, and I would say it sounds slightly different, but it doesn't sound worse. It's like the difference between using one speaker and another speaker, not like one thing is better than the other. And I think it's a testament to how good the speaker simulation is now that, companies like GFI are doing. I think secondly, that the pedal does a really good job of emulating some of these classic clean amp sounds that a lot of our favorite guitar players, which we might have even talked about today, have used. And so it's great to have that as an alternative. And the cool thing, the thing I really appreciate about the GFI, and I'm not doing this to blow smoke at you, but the through input on that, the paralleled through is really amazing for what I like to do, because I can run it with the XLR to the front of the house, and I can return the other side back and go right into the amp. So I have the option to actually run both at the same time, or I can say, hey, I want to hear my amp behind me, but for my in-ears and for the front of the house, I want a controlled, speaker sound, and that's going to be using the GFI. So I really like that it has a through, and a lot of the other ones that are out there are not utilizing or don't even have the option for a through, so you can't feed it back through and have the option to go direct or amped or choose depending on your scenario. So I really appreciate that about that pedal and having that feature.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So what's the future holds for Vertex Effects?
Well, and more pedals on the way. So we'll have that one that's releasing in a couple of weeks. Another one that we have that we're working on, which is not really a secret, is our battery power supply. Mm-hmm. And this is basically so that you can use a 9-volt carbon battery with your desired distortion and overdrive and fuzz and wah pedals. I mean, you could use it on anything, but there's not going to be a whole lot of difference on a lot of pedals. It really depends on the pedal itself and its sensitivity to a supply versus a 9-volt battery. Typically, it's going to be only distortion pedals and fuzz pedals and stuff like that, where the source impedance is going to be important. So anyway, we're going to be releasing that. I actually have a pedal board that I built behind me that has a cool little thing that I wired up that I can show you if you want. I don't know how many people will watch this versus listen to it, so they won't be able to listen to the way that the pedal board looks, but I can show you if that's of interest to you.
Please, yeah.
All right, hold on a sec. All right, so check this out. Let's hold it back here. All right, so basically what I've got is I have 3 pedals on here. These are pedals that I've determined have a sensitivity to batteries versus a power supply. So I have on this side a Chalks power supply, the Chalks 4, and on the opposite side over here, I have my Vertex battery power supply that has 3 carbon batteries in it, so the really cheap batteries. And then in between here, I have a toggle switch, which will allow me to switch the power source for each one of the pedals to the power supply or the battery. So I can go either way, so I can hear the difference in real time between what the battery sounds like and what the power supply sounds like.
In your sorry to cut you off, but is there a difference? Well, what is your preference? Having a power supply?
It depends. So most of the newer pedals have a power supply capacitor on them. So when there is a change that would be meaningful between a carbon battery, a high impedance source, and the DC from the power supply, it mitigates that because it has this giant power supply cap. And the way that you can tell whether something has a really large power supply cap is when you unplug certain pedals, you'll notice that the LED will stay illuminated on some pedals for several seconds before it goes off. And that usually means that that capacitor is pretty large and is holding the voltage steady in there. So variations in what the carbon battery will produce are pretty much eliminated at that point. But if you were to cut that out, that power supply cap, you would notice huge variations in a lot of devices between the supply versus the battery. Now, some of the stuff like that tube screamer, it has, if it's not converted to true bypass and it's like a flip-flop like how that one is, you have to put a small cap in there because it will cause the pedal to remain in the off position, or it won't flip over. So I converted that one to true bypass so I wouldn't have to worry about that, and I just did it internally without having to use a 3-pull double throw mounted into the front of it. But it's pretty significant, and we have a video already that came out a few years ago where I basically show using a similar test to this, tube screamers, vintage wahs, vintage fuzzes, and going back and forth. And it really does make a difference on a lot of devices in terms of how the pedal reacts. And the main thing that most of the power supplies that have voltage sags on them miss is that's only half of the equation of a carbon battery, because you have voltage and you have current, and so there's a voltage drop on carbon batteries that's not linear, or it's not like a supply or an alkaline battery. If you were to look at a curve of an alkaline battery, it's like 9 volts, 9 volts, 9 volts, 9 volts, dead. Whereas on a carbon battery, it's like 9 volts, 8 volts, 7 volts, 6 volts, 5 volts. It's decaying in voltage from the moment that it begins being used. Pair that now with the power supply, is always going to be linear, so it's not going to have that. So if you set it to 8 volts, it just stays at 8 volts. It's steady all the way through. You set it to 7 volts, it's 7 volts all the way through. It's not decaying. It's not fluctuating based on what's happening with the pedal. Because if you were to measure the pedal and you were to dig into the pedal really hard, hit it with a power cord, you could actually see the voltage would dip temporarily, and then it would regenerate maybe back to what its steady state was of whatever was available in the battery. The other thing that's happening is that there's also current limiting happening simultaneously. So you have this interplay between the voltage that's going down and the current is limiting at the same time. And none of the supplies that simulate batteries or even these virtual battery things, they only account for the voltage variable, and it's not variable. It's just static. And they're not accounting for the current limiting aspect, which the carbon batteries do. And so, again, source impedance matters, and that's what the batteries impart. But not all pedals will do that. I would never recommend doing this on digital pedals. I would never recommend doing this on anything that you want to sound linear and you don't want to have like the color that's imparted by a pedal that's kind of operating with some voltage sag and some current limitation. But for overdrive stuff, for fuzzes, for old wah pedals, in distortion, it sounds great, and I think it's preferable, but it's not as convenient as having a supply that never runs out of voltage or current. So it depends on how far down the rabbit hole you want to go.
Oh, man, truly interesting.
I can tell that Henry wants to try it on the Specular Tempest carbon battery.
How common is carbon battery?
Here you can only get them. There's a type of store here that exists. It's called the dollar store, and basically everything that's inside the store is $1, and those are the most common places, or the only place that I'm aware of, other than going to Amazon or something like that, where you can find these carbon batteries. It's a very inefficient battery compared to alkaline, and they're pretty much, they'll probably completely go out of fashion in 10 years. Like there's really no place for them anymore. It's just that they're cheap, and not efficient at all, and they lose voltage quickly. But you can buy them at the dollar store. So I just went there yesterday to prepare for this rig, and I bought about 20 batteries, and I think that they come in packs of 2 or 4, and that's how I'm getting them. And they're great for this. They're terrible batteries to use on anything else. You wouldn't want to use them on a remote control or on anything else that would require a 9-volt battery. But for pedals, they're fantastic for certain ones.
So it's 9 volt?
It's a 9-volt carbon battery. It looks just like a 9-volt Duracell or Energizer or any of the primary brands, except those are all alkaline or lithium or whatever fancy thing they're up to. These are the worst batteries. This is like a battery that you could have got in 1960. If you went to go buy a battery, this would have been what you got.
Mason, we can go on and on. It's really great time talking to you today.
Sure.
And just to let you know that you have a big family here. Anytime you're coming to this region, these guys will take care of you, and just give us a call. Hopefully all the pandemic thing is going to over soon, that we can meet again in near future. And just by talking to you today, I have a mission to go back to the States.
Okay. Yeah, I mean,
to have my rig built by you.
Okay. Yeah. Come on over, we'll do it. And, I think I'm probably, I think we're all banned from leaving. I don't even think I could come to your country right now, even if I wanted to. I think Americans are like banned from, our passports are worthless right now. So, but when things calm down, we'll have to come and build a rig. Maybe we'll build a rig there. We can do it. We can do a clinic, a pedalboard clinic, and we'll use I'll build a GFI pedalboard.
There you go. I think these guys are ready anytime. Just call us, and we are here, man.
Yeah.
And we can go to the John Mayer live concert together.
All right. Yeah, I mean, when was the last time that he came there?
Oh, last year.
Last year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Two shows.
Yeah. Well, I imagine that it'll probably be sooner that I could get there than when concerts will resume. But I appreciate that, and it's always great to talk to you guys, and I really appreciate your products, and I sincerely I'm happy to spread the word, and people who are listening or watching this, we probably don't know the conversations that we have behind the scenes, but there's when I take these to artists, or I have people that are coming through our shop, and I really recommend your stuff, because I think it's really great, and I think that not only does it sound good, but it is a tool that's really useful. I mean, especially like the Cabzeus, is a really useful tool for a lot of people that simplifies the wet dry wet thing, which is an intent that it sounds like you guys weren't even aware of, but that's a real problem solver for a lot of people that want to do this, and they don't want to take 3 amps. And I think that there's some really amazing equipment that you guys are making, so continue to do what you're doing, and I hope that we can all get together here soon.
Likewise, man. And please check out Mason's the Rick podcast, the Rick Doctor podcast, on Spotify and Apple Podcast, and also the YouTube channel, of course, the Rick Doctor for Vertex Effects, and also check out the Patreon page. I need to have some lunch now, man. Patreon.com/Rick Doctor.
All right. Thanks, guys.
That's it for the podcast today. Thanks again, Mason, for your time.
My absolute pleasure, guys. Thank you.